Let me maybe briefly first say that there were two major changes made when we shifted from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. The first one was that for the first time, an emphasis was put on the reduction of inequalities, both within countries and between countries, and this is what Sustainable Development Goal number 10 mentions. In particular, this is target 10.4, by adequate fiscal, wage, and social protection policies. Why is this important? This is important, and it was linked to the objective of taking environment on board, because if we have more equal societies, it means that poverty reduction can be achieved with less impressive growth. It means that consumption will be driven less by the desire to imitate the most affluent within societies and will be corresponding more to the needs that people actually have. And it means that there will be less of a temptation for the poorest, those who have been left out, to survive by destroying natural resources. And I think, therefore, this insistence on reducing inequalities is very closely linked to the agenda on sustainable development in its environmental component. But of course, it is also linked, this insistence on reducing inequalities, to the idea that poverty is not an absolute concept only, is also relative to the position one occupies within a particular society, and it explains the centrality of social protection in the Sustainable Development Goals, which is referred to by Sustainable Development Goal number 1 and number 10. The International Labour Organization, with the adoption of Recommendation 202 in June 2012 by the International Labour Conference, has of course very importantly contributed to putting social protection at the center of the global agenda. And it has managed to convince social partners, governments, to do this for two reasons. First, because we understand that an economy is not viable if you have a large mass of people living in poverty, and to stimulate growth, to stimulate demand, we need therefore to allow those people to have simply a better purchasing power. This is, of course, one first and major reason to move towards social protection, and it is also part of the reason why China, as mentioned by Isabel Ortiz, has understood that it should invest in boosting local demand in order to support its growth further and to protect its growth from economic shocks that may result from economic crisis elsewhere. The second reason why social protection has become so important is simply because, far from being the outcome of development, it is a precondition for sustainable development, as Minister Alexander De Croo mentioned and as Guy Ryder mentioned. And the reason for this is that if families have social protection, they will have fewer children, as they do not have to fear for their old age, and they will therefore be able to take better care of the children. And this is part of the reason why it's extremely important to invest in social protection, even and perhaps particularly in the least developed countries today. However, despite this very strong support in particular illustrated by the adoption unanimously, with one exception, by the International Labour Conference of the Recommendation 202, we still face a number of challenges. And I listed the challenges that were most frequently mentioned in the course of our discussions. First, there is the question of the capacity of poor countries in particular to put in place an effective social protection scheme and to deliver services to their population. Of course, there's a right to social security under Article 9 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but many countries simply do not have the administrative capacity to deliver on this, and part of this is the difficult access to data in some countries, and Mr. Yemtsov from the World Bank mentioned that 57 countries, for example, do not have such data allowing at household level to identify the needs. Although this was sort of nuanced by Androuin mentioning the Social Security Inquiry, it is one first major problem. A second major problem is, of course, that budgets may be insufficient. The major part of the economy may still be informal. There are many illicit financial flows that do not allow governments to capture the wealth that is produced in their country, and there are large unmet needs linked to massive poverty in very poor countries. So it is indeed important to ask about financing, and I shall have a few words to say about this. A third difficulty is that many economies are just not resilient to shocks. We are speaking here for the least developed countries, of countries that have often a very poorly diversified economy. Countries who risk losing revenues from exports if the one commodity in which they're specialized loses value on international markets. Countries that are very much on the front line of climate change, who risk facing natural disasters repeatedly in the future. Countries also who are deeply dependent of global crisis with the globalization of markets, and which, for example, may suffer from a loss of incomes if there are financial crisis, economic crisis in rich countries to which they export. So all these are quite fragile economies that may not dare to invest in long-term social protection schemes because governments may have a legitimate fear that these schemes may not be fiscally sustainable in the future. Indeed, it is not perhaps by accident that the countries that moved towards establishing robust social protection are large countries such as Brazil, with Bolsa Familia and many others, such as Mexico with Progresa, to which Oportunidades succeeded, such as India with the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, or such as South Africa with the Child Allowances Program that is one of the most interesting in the world. These are relatively large countries in which what happens in one region affected by a drought, a flood, or by an economic shock can be compensated by what happens in other regions. So small, weak economies do not have this resilience, and they must be protected from those shocks. Fourth and finally, there is, of course, the question of international competition. In some sectors that are highly labor-intensive, some governments still believe that the lower the costs of labor, the more attractive they will be to investors. Of course, we know that it is not true, and in fact, I trust Roberto Soares Santos would confirm this. Investors are not interested in low-cost economies. They're interested in going where the resources are. They're interested in going where the markets are emerging. They're interested in a qualified workforce being well trained to work in the production plants in which investments are made. And I would add that it is not particularly promising for a country to invest in essentially developing an economy in which the comparative advantage of the country is in its population remaining poor. Yet this is sometimes what countries seem to think when they fear that better protecting workers, when they fear that establishing more robust social protection schemes will make them less competitive on global markets and less attractive to investors. Now, as to what the next steps are to implement this ambitious program and to make the objective of eradicating global poverty and establishing social protection schemes universally I would say there are two directions in which we could think the next few steps, and two directions that have been mentioned. First of all, there is, of course, a need for an international mechanism to support countries to establish social protection floors. Recommendation 202 mentions in paragraph 12 that social protection floors should be primarily financed by national resources, but the countries whose economic capacities or fiscal capacities are insufficient should be encouraged to request international cooperation in this regard. And this is why Magdalena Sepulveda and myself, we put forward a proposal in October 2012 for a global fund for social protection that was supported later by the European Parliament and by some other actors. Now, this social protection fund has two components, and it's important to make this distinction. First of all, there was this idea that social protection schemes should be financed with some support of the international community. Of course, it is in many countries affordable to establish a basic protection for pensions, for healthcare, for child allowances, for employment insurance. But some particularly poor countries where the needs are vast may require some support to get things going. The ILO, in its recent estimates, considers that on average, for 90 developing countries, it's 2.9% of the GNP of these countries that would be necessary to invest in social protection. But this percentage is, for example, 28% for a country such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has such an important unmet need of the population that it must need. So financing is necessary, and co-financing by the international community and by domestic resources being gradually mobilized might be the best option, and this is one of the issues that will be discussed in Addis Ababa between 13th and 16th of July of this year at the conference on financing for development. Indeed, a recent study of the Overseas Development Institute on a global Bolsa Familia proposal confirms the viability of this kind of co-financing scheme, the idea being that whilst the international community should step in to kickstart the process, gradually domestic resources should take over, and in perhaps 5, 7, 10 years, those national resources could be sufficient to fully finance the social protection scheme that has been established. But this kind of compact between rich countries and poor countries could create predictability in the kind of aid that is provided. It could be combined with relatively strict standards as to how social protection schemes should be governed and monitored so that they benefit the population and reach, in particular, the poorest segments of the population. And it would be one way to encourage the countries who are hesitating to move in this direction to do so sooner rather than later. A second component of this global fund for social protection is actually quite different. It's a reinsurance component, allowing the countries who want to establish social protection schemes but do not dare to do so because they fear it may not be fiscally sustainable, to buy insurance so that if they face an economic shock, a sudden loss of export revenues, a sudden increase of their import bills, a natural disaster, they will be protected from the risk of their social protection scheme not being financeable with the resources that they have at their disposal. What this means very simply is that the international community could finance the purchase of a premium, allowing these countries to be compensated of the losses they would incur, making it impossible for them potentially in the face of such a shock to continue to support their population based on the standing social protection scheme they would have adopted. In other terms, it's a way to overcome the problem that countries who are not resilient, countries who have a fragile economy, may experience the unwillingness of these countries to take a risk of making promises to their population that they will not be able to keep. So financing is one major component of what I believe we should do.
Very briefly now, if you would.
A second component is, and this will be, of course, dear to the heart of Bogdan Vandenberg, and was also mentioned by Sharon Burrow from the International Trade Unions Congress. It is what we call policy coherence for development. It is in the different areas, taxation, trade, investment, to identify how development could be better supported, in particular to support the establishment of social protection floors. Now, there are many ways to do this, including, quite importantly, the need for better international coordination in the area of taxation. As Sharon Burrow mentioned, the principle should be to pay where the money is earned. But I would like to highlight that it is also important to gradually ensure that the private sector is encouraged to contribute to the establishment of social protection schemes that are viable, for example, by systematically making access to public procurement conditional upon the company seeking to be granted a public contract, complying with applicable labor legislation and international labor standards, and monitoring its supply chain to ensure that all the companies it sources from and its subcontracts to comply with these requirements and pay their contributions to social security systems. This is what is now allowed in the EU by Directive 2014-24. This is what is allowed by the government procurement agreement of the WTO after it was revised in 2014, and this is something encouraged by paragraph 10b of recommendation 202 of the International Labour Conference. And indeed, Isabel Ortiz was quite right to emphasize the important tool that this could represent. I close with 3 remarks. First, we now are in an interesting period in which we move from temporary safety nets, allowing governments to meet situations of emergency, if you wish, coming at the rescue of their population in need, to a situation in which we are increasingly seeing countries in all regions moving towards standing social protection schemes that are rights-based. And I think the remarks of Magdalena Sepulveda on what rights-based means are extremely important. It means basically that people are not simply passive beneficiaries of charity-based measures that governments at some point in time decide to allocate to them and then may remove at will. People are redefined as rights holders that can claim benefits before independent bodies, so that this avoids or reduces the risk of corruption, of discrimination, and of arbitrariness in the way these benefits are being provided. And Ambassador Benedicte Franquinet was quite right in this regard to emphasize the importance of the rule of law, of good governance, of accountability of governments towards their populations, because I firmly believe that social protection is only viable in the long term if it's combined with strengthened accountability of governments towards their population.
Olivier, really briefly now, if you would, we are out of time.
I finish with simply two remarks to say first that competitiveness today cannot be simply for developing countries based on reducing costs. It must be in investing in workforce. And thirdly and finally, I think it is also this discussion symptomatic of aid fatigue of donors. Aid, as usual, project-based, short-term, fragmented, is something that donors are tired of, and we need to move towards something that goes beyond aid and invests in the future of these countries, and social protection is the area in which today investments should be made. Thank you very much, Jackie.
So much.